My grandfather told me this story 3 days before he passed away in 1991. He was 91 years old, and his mind was still sharp as a blade. He made me promise to share it someday, to let people know what happened to him in those mountains. This was in October 1919, right after World War I ended. He was a young soldier trying to get home through the Appalachian wilderness when a storm hit. He found shelter in a cabin. When he woke up at dawn, he was lying in an empty field. This is his story. My grandfather, Samuel Hayes, sat in his hospital bed and gripped my hand with surprising strength for a man his age. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Something I've kept quiet about for 72 years. When I'm gone, people should know this happened." He told me about October 1919. He was 23 years old, fresh back from the war in France, traveling on foot through the West Virginia mountains, trying to reach his family's farm. He had no money, just a military pack and the clothes on his back. On the third day, a massive storm rolled in. He described it as the worst weather he'd ever encountered, worse than anything he'd faced in the trenches of Europe. Rain came down like a wall of water. Lightning struck so close he could smell the burning ozone. His uniform was soaked through within minutes, and he knew hypothermia would take him if he didn't find shelter. He pushed through the forest, his training from the war kicking in. Survival meant finding protection from the elements. That's when he spotted it through the trees. A small wooden cabin with smoke rising from the chimney and warm light glowing in the windows. "I knew something was wrong immediately," my grandfather said. "I'd studied the maps. There were no homesteads marked in that area. But I was freezing and desperate, so I went anyway." He knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked again, calling out over the thunder. Still nothing. The door was unlocked, so he pushed it open and stepped inside. The cabin was warm and dry. A fire burned in the stone fireplace. There was a bed, a table with 2 chairs, shelves with supplies. A pot of stew hung over the fire, still warm, but there was no sign of anyone living there. "That should have been my warning," he told me. "An occupied cabin in the middle of nowhere, fire burning, food cooking, but nobody home during the worst storm of the season? That's not natural." But he was exhausted and half frozen. He closed the door, hung his coat by the fire, and sat down to warm up. As the feeling returned to his hands and feet, he started noticing strange details. The furniture was old-fashioned, not just old, but styled in a way that seemed wrong for 1919. Everything looked hand-carved, with techniques from another era. The wood showed no marks from modern tools. The construction methods were from decades earlier, maybe longer, and the fire kept burning at exactly the same level. He watched it for over an hour, and it never changed. The wood never diminished. It just burned, steadily, impossibly, without consuming any fuel. "I told myself I was just tired," my grandfather said, "that I wasn't seeing clearly because of exhaustion. But I knew. Deep down, I knew something was very wrong with that place." He waited for the owner to return. 2 hours passed. 3. The storm continued raging outside. Finally, exhaustion overwhelmed him. He moved to the bed and lay down, telling himself he'd just rest for a moment. He fell asleep instantly. The last thing he remembered was the warmth of the fire and the sound of rain on the roof. When he woke up, everything had changed in a way that would haunt him for the rest of his life. My grandfather described waking up to cold autumn sunlight on his face. For a moment, he felt peaceful, warm, rested. Then he opened his eyes. He was lying in an open field, no cabin, no walls, no roof. Just empty ground covered in fallen leaves, with his blanket spread beneath him and morning dew soaking through his clothes. He sat up fast, his heart pounding. The field stretched out in every direction, dotted with a few scattered trees. There was no structure anywhere in sight, no foundation stones, no ash from a fireplace, no sign that any building had ever existed in this location. "I thought I was losing my mind," he told me. "I checked everything. My coat was still damp from the rain, exactly as wet as when I'd hung it by the fire. My boots were next to me, placed carefully, as if I'd taken them off inside a cabin. But there was no cabin." He stood up and walked in circles, searching for any evidence of the building he'd sheltered in. The ground showed no disturbance, no post holes, no clearing where a structure might have stood. Just natural forest floor with years of undisturbed leaf litter. The psychological impact was immediate and severe. My grandfather had been trained to trust his observations. In the war, accurate perception meant survival. But now his senses were telling him two completely contradictory things. He definitely slept inside a cabin, yet no cabin existed. This kind of experience is what psychologists call a dissociative event, where reality doesn't match memory in ways that can't be easily explained. But my grandfather insisted his memory was crystal clear. He could describe every detail of that cabin, the grain patterns in the wood, the way the firelight flickered on the walls, the smell of the stew cooking over the fire. He gathered his belongings and tried to get his bearings. The storm had passed, leaving a clear blue sky. He could see the mountain ridges in the distance and used them to orient himself. According to his position, he should have been about 3 miles from where he remembered entering the cabin. 3 miles, he emphasized to me. I'd walked through a storm for maybe 20 minutes before finding that place. But somehow, overnight,
I traveled 3 miles while sleeping. That's not possible. Not unless... He didn't finish that sentence, but I understood what he was thinking. Not unless the cabin itself had moved, or not unless he'd never been in a real cabin at all. He continued his journey home, but the experience stayed with him. When he finally reached his family's farm 2 days later, he told his father what had happened. His father, a practical mountain man who'd lived in those hills his entire life, listened carefully and then said something my grandfather never forgot. "There are old places in these mountains," his father had said. "Places that don't follow normal rules. The Cherokee people who lived here before us had stories about shelters that appeared to help travelers in need, then vanished by morning. They called them spirit houses. They believed these places existed between the world we know and somewhere else." My grandfather had dismissed this as superstition at first. He'd been educated, served in a modern war, seen the world. He didn't believe in spirits or supernatural explanations. But over the following weeks he couldn't stop thinking about it. He researched everything he could find about the area where he'd sheltered. He spoke with old-timers who knew the mountain trails, and what he discovered made the mystery even deeper. 3 other people, over a span of 40 years, had reported almost identical experiences in roughly the same area. A traveler in 1887, a surveyor in 1903, a logging crew member in 1912. All of them described finding shelter during bad weather, sleeping safely through the night, and waking up in an open field with no sign of any structure. The reports were too similar to be coincidence, my grandfather told me. Same type of cabin, same warm fire that never consumed wood, same feeling that something was wrong but being too exhausted to care.
And every single one of them woke up miles from where they remembered falling asleep. The most disturbing detail? All of them mentioned the stew cooking over the fire, the same pot, the same smell, even though the incidents were decades apart, as if the cabin existed in some kind of loop, repeating the same scene for anyone who found it. My grandfather made 3 trips back to those mountains over the years, trying to find that spot again. He never could. The terrain had no landmarks distinct enough to pinpoint the exact location. And something about the area seemed to resist being found. Compasses acted strangely there. Distances felt wrong. Even experienced woodsmen got disoriented. "I've spent 72 years trying to understand what happened," he said to me that day in the hospital.
And I've come to accept that I'll never know for certain. But I'll tell you what I believe. My grandfather leaned back against his hospital pillow and continued. I believe that cabin exists in a place between moments. Not between locations, but between times. It appears when someone truly needs it, offers shelter, and then returns to wherever it came from. He explained his theory carefully, the way a scientist would present findings. He'd spent decades researching similar phenomena around the world. There were documented cases of buildings appearing and disappearing throughout history. In England, travelers reported finding monasteries that vanished by morning. In Japan, mountain climbers spoke of shrines that couldn't be found again. In the American Southwest, hikers described adobe structures that left no trace. The common thread, he said, is that these places appear during moments of genuine need, extreme weather, injury, exhaustion, times when a person might not survive without intervention, and they always vanish without physical evidence. Modern physics, he told me, had begun exploring concepts that might explain such things.
Quantum mechanics suggested reality might be less solid than we perceive. Time might not flow in a single direction. Parallel possibilities might exist simultaneously. I'm not saying I understand it, he admitted, but I'm saying there's room in our understanding of the universe for places that don't follow the rules we expect. What troubled him most over the years wasn't the impossibility of what happened. It was the question of purpose. Why would such a place exist? What created it? Was it natural, like some kind of temporal anomaly? Or was it intentional, built by something or someone with capabilities beyond our comprehension? He showed me a folder he'd kept for decades. Inside were letters, carefully preserved, from the other people who'd experienced the vanishing shelter. He'd tracked them down over the years, corresponding with them, comparing details. The surveyor from 1903, a man named Charles Whitmore, had written, "The cabin felt protective, almost motherly, as if it knew I needed help and appeared specifically to provide it. When I woke in the empty field, I felt abandoned, but also grateful. Whatever that place was, it saved my life." The logging crew member from 1912, Joseph Brennan, described something my grandfather hadn't mentioned yet. "While I slept, I had the most vivid dream. I saw the cabin in different time periods. Sometimes it looked new, with a family living there. Sometimes it was abandoned and decaying. Sometimes it didn't exist at all. Like I was seeing every version of it that ever was or could be, all at once." This detail fascinated my grandfather because he'd experienced something similar, but had dismissed it as just a dream. Now, learning that others had the same experience, it seemed more significant. We all dreamed of the cabin's history, he told me, and our dreams matched. We all saw the same family, the same time periods, the same sequence of events. That's not how normal dreams work. That suggests we were accessing something real, some kind of recorded information embedded in that place. The most recent account came from 1967. A young woman named Sarah Chen had been hiking alone when a blizzard struck unexpectedly. She found the cabin, sheltered there, and woke up in an empty clearing. She'd written to my grandfather after seeing a newspaper article where he'd cautiously mentioned his experience. She described details I'd never published, my grandfather said. The exact pattern of the stone fireplace, the way the door latch worked, the number of shelves on the wall. She couldn't have known these things unless she'd been in the same place. But Sarah's account added something new. She'd found an object in the cabin that was still with her when she woke up. A small wooden carving, a bird in flight, beautifully detailed. She'd sent my grandfather a photograph of it. He pulled that photograph from his folder and showed it to me. The carving was exquisite, made with techniques that predated modern tools. "I had this analyzed by experts," he said. "The wood is from a tree species that went extinct in that region over 200 years ago. The carving style matches techniques used by indigenous peoples in the 1600s. This object proved the cabin wasn't just a hallucination or shared dream. It was real enough to contain physical items. Real enough for those items to cross over into our world when someone took them. Sarah kept that carving her whole life, my grandfather said. She told me it brought her comfort, made her feel protected. But it also made her sad because she could never find that cabin again, never thank whoever or whatever had saved her. He looked at me with those sharp, clear eyes. I'm telling you this because I believe these places still exist. The vanishing shelter is still out there, somewhere between then and now, waiting to appear for the next person who truly needs it. And when I'm gone, someone should remember.
Someone should know that there are helpful mysteries in this world, not just frightening ones.
My grandfather's research led him to an elderly Cherokee man named William Redbird in 1952. Mr. Redbird was in his 80s then, one of the last people who remembered the old stories passed down through generations before his people were forcibly removed from those mountains in the 1830s. Your grandfather came to me with respect, Mr. Redbird had written in a letter my grandfather kept. He didn't demand answers or treat our stories as primitive superstition. He listened, so I told him what my grandmother told me. The Cherokee had known about the vanishing shelter for centuries. They called it Unega Adanvado, which roughly translates to the White Spirit's house, or the helping place. It wasn't considered dangerous or evil, quite the opposite. According to the traditional stories, the shelter appeared long before European settlers arrived. Cherokee hunters and travelers would sometimes find it during dangerous weather. The protocols for encountering it were specific. Enter respectfully. Take only the shelter offered. Leave no trace of your presence, and never try to claim ownership of what you found there. My grandmother said the shelter belonged to a spirit who had once been human, Mr. Redbird explained in his letter. A woman who had lost her family to sickness during a terrible winter. She died trying to help other travelers, giving them her last food and warmth. The Great Spirit honored her sacrifice by letting her continue helping people, even after passing from this world. This aligned eerily with what my grandfather and the others had dreamed while sleeping in the cabin. They'd all seen visions of a woman, though her appearance varied slightly in each person's account. Always caring for the cabin, always preparing food, always tending the fire, as if she was still performing the duties she dedicated herself to in life.
My grandfather found this explanation both comforting and unsettling. Comforting because it suggested the cabin had a benevolent purpose. Unsettling because it implied consciousness and intention behind the phenomenon. Mr. Redbird's letter continued with a warning that the Cherokee elders had passed down. The helping place appears where it's needed, but it exists in a delicate balance. It should never be sought deliberately, only accepted when offered. Those who try to find it with selfish intentions, or who try to prove its existence to exploit it, will never see it. The Spirit knows the difference between genuine need and mere curiosity. This explained why my grandfather could never relocate the cabin, despite multiple attempts. His initial encounter had been born of true desperation during the storm. His later searches were driven by curiosity and the desire to understand. The cabin, or the consciousness behind it, apparently distinguished between these motivations. What fascinated my grandfather most was learning that similar stories existed in other Cherokee oral traditions, not just about shelters, but about helpful phenomena that appeared during times of crisis and disappeared afterward. Food that appeared when someone was starving. Water sources that emerged during droughts. Bridges that materialized over dangerous rivers. We called them threshold gifts, Mr. Redbird wrote. Things that exist on the threshold between the physical and spiritual worlds. They're real enough to save lives, but they don't belong permanently to either realm. They serve their purpose and return to wherever they came from. My grandfather spent years contemplating this perspective. Western science sought to explain phenomena through measurable, repeatable processes. But what if some things existed specifically to defy those requirements? What if certain helpful mysteries were designed to appear only in moments of genuine need, precisely to prevent exploitation?
He began documenting other threshold phenomena across different cultures. The Japanese had stories of tsukumogami, objects that gain spirits after long use and sometimes help their owners. Celtic traditions spoke of fairy mounds that offered shelter to lost travelers. Native American tribes across the continent had variations of helpful spirits that manifested in physical forms. The common threads were striking. These phenomena appeared during genuine crises, offered exactly what was needed, left minimal physical evidence, and resisted documentation or exploitation. It was as if the universe had created a category of help that specifically couldn't be abused or commodified. Maybe that's the point, my grandfather told me in the hospital. Maybe these things exist because there are situations where ordinary help can't arrive in time. A shelter that follows normal rules wouldn't appear in the middle of wilderness during a sudden storm. But a shelter that exists outside normal rules can be exactly where it's needed, exactly when it's needed. He pulled out another document from his folder, this one more recent. It was a study from 1987 by parapsychologists investigating what they called psi-assisted survival events. Cases where people survived impossible situations through means that couldn't be explained by luck alone. The researchers had identified patterns similar to what my grandfather had found. Shelters appearing during storms. Food sources discovered by lost hikers at the point of starvation. Rescue arriving through highly improbable coincidences. They theorized that consciousness itself, either individual or collective, might have the ability to influence reality during extreme circumstances. I don't know if that's right, my grandfather said, but I know what I experienced was real, and I know it saved my life. Whatever the vanishing shelter is, wherever it comes from, I'm grateful for it. In 1965, my grandfather made a breakthrough in his research. He'd been searching through old county records, land deeds, and census data for the region where he'd found the cabin. What he discovered gave him chills. There had been a homestead in that approximate area, recorded in territorial documents from 1782. The land was registered to a widow named Margaret Ashwood, age 34, living alone after losing her husband and 2 children to illness during the harsh winter of 1781. The records indicated that Margaret had maintained a way station for travelers crossing the mountain passes. She provided shelter and food to anyone who needed it, asking nothing in return. Local accounts described her as deeply compassionate, driven by grief to help others avoid the suffering she'd endured. The final entry about Margaret came from a minister's journal dated March 1783. Found the Ashwood cabin empty. No sign of disturbance or struggle. Margaret's belongings remain. Food prepared. Fire burning in the hearth. But the woman herself has vanished. Searchers found no trace. It is as if she simply ceased to exist, leaving her home exactly as she maintained it for travelers. My grandfather showed me a sketch that accompanied these records. The cabin's layout matched his memory perfectly. The stone fireplace in the same location. The shelves arranged identically. Even the table and chairs corresponded to what he'd seen. This is when I knew I wasn't experiencing a hallucination, he told me. The cabin I sheltered in was Margaret Ashwood's home, existing somehow more than a century after she disappeared. The stew cooking on the fire, the maintained appearance, everything suggested she was still caring for travelers even after passing from this world. He'd tried to find more information about Margaret, but historical records from that era were sparse. What he did find painted a picture of a woman who'd transformed her grief into service. After losing everything, she dedicated her remaining years to ensuring others survived their journeys through those dangerous mountains. Local folklore from the late 1700s, which my grandfather discovered in a historical society archive, mentioned the Angel of the Mountain Pass. Travelers would speak of finding unexpected shelter during terrible weather, always describing the same cabin, always mentioning the warm fire and prepared food. But when they tried to return to thank their benefactor or bring payment, they could never find the place again. These stories date back to when Margaret was still alive, my grandfather explained, which suggests the phenomenon started even before she disappeared. Maybe she had already begun existing partially in that threshold space, appearing to help people while simultaneously living her normal life. And when she finally passed, she simply continued doing what she'd always done. This concept troubled him philosophically. Was Margaret Ashwood aware of what she'd become? Did she understand that she was helping people across centuries? Or was it more like an echo, a recording of her caring nature playing out repeatedly whenever someone needed it? He'd written to several theologians and philosophers over the years, presenting the situation hypothetically. Their responses varied widely. Some believed it represented a soul choosing to delay its final rest in order to continue good works. Others suggested it might be a form of temporal loop, where Margaret's actions during her life had created a permanent impression on that location. A few thought it could be a manifestation of collective consciousness, humanity's need for help creating a helpful presence, using Margaret's memory as a template. "I prefer to think she knows," my grandfather said quietly. "I prefer to believe that Margaret Ashwood understands she's still helping people, still saving lives, and that it brings her peace. The alternative, that it's just some unconscious phenomenon using her image, feels wrong somehow. There was too much intention in that cabin, too much care." He'd also discovered something else in those records. Margaret hadn't just disappeared from her cabin. On the same night she vanished, 3 travelers caught in a sudden blizzard reported finding shelter in a cabin that matched her description, miles from where her actual homestead stood. They survived the night, woke in an open field, and returned to town speaking of a miracle. She was already helping people beyond the physical limitations of her cabin, my grandfather said, already existing in multiple places simultaneously. Her disappearance wasn't an ending. It was a transformation. She became entirely what she'd been dedicating herself to becoming, a shelter for those in desperate need. The most remarkable document he'd found was a letter Margaret had written to the minister shortly before her disappearance. It had been preserved in church archives and dated February 1783. "I have felt myself becoming less tied to this world and more tied to my purpose. My body grows weak, but my will to help grows stronger. If I should pass, I pray that my service continues. Let this cabin remain a refuge. Let no traveler face the cold alone if I can prevent it." It was essentially a prayer, a request that her work would continue beyond her death. And somehow, impossibly, that prayer had been answered. Margaret Ashwood had become permanent in her purpose, existing outside normal time to help people across centuries. My grandfather folded the documents carefully and returned them to his folder. I spent decades researching this, trying to understand it through science and history. But maybe the simplest explanation is the right one. A good person made a selfless wish, and something in the universe honored that wish. Margaret wanted to keep helping people even after death, and she does. My grandfather wasn't content with just spiritual or folklore explanations. He wanted to understand if modern science could offer any framework for what he'd experienced. In the 1970s, he began corresponding with physicists working on quantum mechanics and theoretical physics. "I wrote to them carefully," he told me. "I didn't want to sound like a crazy old man. I presented it as a hypothetical. What if an object could exist in multiple time periods simultaneously? What if consciousness could imprint itself on a location so strongly that it persisted across centuries?" One physicist from Princeton, Dr. Eleanor Vance, took his question seriously. She wrote back with theories that, while speculative, provided a scientific vocabulary for thinking about the vanishing shelter. Dr. Vance explained the concept of quantum superposition, where particles can exist in multiple states simultaneously until observed. She proposed that perhaps, under certain rare conditions, macroscopic objects like buildings might exhibit similar properties. Not in the normal world, but in locations where unusual energy conditions or consciousness effects created what she called probability pockets. "Think of it like this," she'd written. "Reality is more fluid than we perceive. Most places have a single stable timeline, but some locations, through unusual circumstances, might exist in multiple timelines at once. A building that was there in 1783 and not there in 1919 might, in a quantum sense, be both there and not there simultaneously. An observer in desperate need might collapse that superposition in a way that lets them access the version where the shelter exists." My grandfather found this fascinating, but admitted he didn't fully understand it. She was basically saying that the cabin exists in a state of maybe, and desperate people somehow tip that maybe into a yes. I don't know if that's real physics or just a creative way to describe magic, but it gave me a framework to think about it. Another researcher he corresponded with, Dr. James Whitmore from MIT, focused on the consciousness aspect. He was studying cases of what he called intention persistence, where strong emotional states seem to leave measurable effects on environments. Dr. Whitmore sent my grandfather studies showing that buildings where traumatic or intensely emotional events occurred sometimes displayed unusual properties. Electromagnetic anomalies, temperature variations, even reports of people sensing or seeing echoes of past events. He theorized that consciousness might interact with physical space in ways science was only beginning to measure. Margaret Ashwood's dedication to helping travelers was intense and sustained over years, Dr. Whitmore wrote. If consciousness can affect environment, and if her intention was strong enough, it's conceivable that she imprinted her purpose onto that location. Not just a memory, but an active, functioning manifestation of her will to help. The cabin appears because her intention, somehow preserved, responds to genuine need. My grandfather also discovered research into temporal anomalies. There were documented cases, mostly dismissed by mainstream science, of locations where time seemed to behave strangely. Clocks running at different speeds, people reporting lost time or experiencing events in unusual sequences. The military had even investigated some of these during the war, wondering if temporal distortions could be weaponized. What if Margaret's cabin exists in a temporal loop? My grandfather speculated. What if that night in 1783, when she disappeared, somehow created a sealed moment in time? The cabin, as it was that night, preserved perfectly, repeating endlessly. And people in desperate need somehow accessed that preserved moment, stepping temporarily into 1783 before returning to their own time. This would explain why the cabin never aged, why the fire never consumed wood, why everything seemed frozen in a perfect state of readiness. It wasn't continuously existing through all the years between 1783 and now. It was existing only in that one preserved moment, which desperate travelers could briefly access. The most compelling scientific perspective came from a researcher studying consciousness and survival instincts. Dr. Patricia Morrison proposed that human consciousness, when facing life-threatening situations, might access abilities normally dormant or unrecognized. "We know the mind can do extraordinary things under extreme stress," she wrote to my grandfather. "People lift impossible weights to save loved ones. Mothers sense when their children are in danger from miles away. Perhaps, when survival is at stake, consciousness can reach across barriers we normally can't perceive. Not creating the shelter, but finding it across time or probability, pulling it into our reality through sheer need." This suggested that the cabin didn't move to the travelers. The travelers, through desperate necessity, moved themselves to the cabin. They accessed a version of reality where Margaret's shelter existed and could help them. Then, when the crisis passed and that extreme need faded, they returned to normal reality where the cabin no longer stood. "I don't know which explanation is correct," my grandfather admitted. "Maybe they all are in different ways. Maybe the truth involves aspects of quantum physics, consciousness, temporal anomalies, and spiritual intention all working together in ways we can't fully understand yet. What matters is that it works. People in genuine need find shelter. Lives are saved. Margaret's wish to help continues being fulfilled." He paused, looking tired but satisfied. Science and spirituality don't have to be enemies. Maybe they're both trying to describe the same mysteries from different angles. The cabin exists, I know that. How it exists might be less important than why it exists, to help people. And that's beautiful, whether you explain it with quantum mechanics or with the persistence of a good soul's love. In 1985, my grandfather received a phone call that changed everything. A man named David Martinez had read a small mention of the vanishing shelter in a paranormal research journal and was desperate to speak with someone who'd experienced it, because he'd found the cabin just months earlier, and his story added a new dimension to the mystery. David was a park ranger, experienced in wilderness survival, not someone prone to imagination or panic. In November 1984, he'd been conducting a routine patrol in a remote section of the Appalachian wilderness when an unexpected ice storm hit with devastating speed. "I knew I was in serious trouble," David told my grandfather during their first meeting. "The temperature dropped 40 degrees in less than an hour. Ice was forming on everything. My radio wasn't working. I had maybe 30 minutes before hypothermia would set in, and I was miles from any known shelter." That's when he saw it, through the freezing rain, a cabin, smoke rising from the chimney, exactly as my grandfather and the others had described decades earlier. David didn't hesitate. Survival training told him to take any shelter available in conditions that severe. He found the door unlocked, entered, and experienced the same impossible warmth, the same fire that burned without consuming wood, the same pot of stew hanging over the flames. But David's account included something the others hadn't mentioned. He saw her. "There was a woman there," he said, his voice still filled with awe. "Not solid, not quite transparent, but present. She was tending the fire, and when I entered she looked at me and smiled. She didn't speak, but I understood. She wanted me to warm up, to eat, to rest. I felt safer in that moment than I'd ever felt in my life." My grandfather leaned forward intensely when David described this. None of the previous accounts had mentioned actually seeing Margaret Ashwood. They'd sensed a presence, felt cared for, but never saw a figure. David continued, "I sat by the fire, and she moved around the cabin doing small tasks, arranging things on shelves, checking the stew. It was like watching someone go about their normal evening routine. I tried to thank her, to ask who she was, but she just smiled and gestured for me to rest." He'd fallen asleep in the chair by the fire, just as my grandfather had, but his dreams were different, vivid and detailed, showing Margaret's life, Her family before the illness, her grief afterward, her decision to help travelers, her gradual realization that she was becoming something more than human, something that existed to serve a purpose. In the dream, she showed me her transformation, David explained. It wasn't sudden. Over years of helping people, of dedicating herself completely to that purpose, she began to exist more in that intention than in her physical body. By the time she disappeared in 1783, she'd already become more spirit than flesh. The disappearance was just her physical form catching up to what she'd already become. When David woke at dawn, he was lying in an empty field, just like all the others. But he'd brought something back with him. A small metal locket that had been sitting on the cabin's shelf. Inside was a miniature portrait of a woman, a man, and 2 children. On the back was engraved, "Ashwood Family, 1780. My grandfather held that locket with trembling hands when David showed it to him. "This proves it," he said. "This is physical evidence that the cabin is real, that Margaret is real, not just a shared hallucination or atmospheric phenomenon. This locket existed in 1780, was in that cabin in 1984, and is here now in 1985. David had tried to return the locket, making multiple trips back to the area where he'd found the cabin. He never could locate it again,
But he reported feeling a sense of approval, as if Margaret wanted him to keep it, as if she wanted proof to exist in the world that her story was real. "She spoke to me in that final dream, just before I woke up," David said quietly. "Not with words, but I understood. She told me she wasn't lonely, that helping people across all these years had given her purpose and peace. She said she chose this, and she'd choose it again. The only sadness she felt was knowing that people who experienced her help would spend their lives wondering if it was real. That's why she'd let David keep the locket, so he'd have proof, so he could tell others and be believed, not to seek fame or attention, but so people would know that compassion could transcend even death, that dedication to helping others could become eternal." My grandfather and David stayed in contact for years after that. They compared notes, theories, experiences. David had documented his encounter meticulously, including photographs of the area where he'd woken up, weather records from that night proving the severity of the storm, and statements from other rangers confirming he couldn't have survived without shelter. Together we built the most complete picture possible of what Margaret Ashwood had become, my grandfather told me. A consciousness dedicated to helping those in desperate need, manifesting as a physical shelter that exists outside normal time and space. Not a ghost haunting a location, but an active, benevolent presence, continuing to fulfill the purpose she'd chosen in life. David made one more contribution to the research. He'd consulted with a theologian who specialized in mystical experiences across different faiths. The theologian pointed out that Margaret's transformation paralleled stories from multiple religious traditions. Buddhist bodhisattvas who delayed enlightenment to help others. Christian saints whose works continued after death. Indigenous spirit guides who protected travelers. "Maybe Margaret became something that exists in many traditions," the theologian had suggested. "A human who loved others so completely that she transcended normal existence to become a permanent helper, not confined to one religion's explanation, but representing a universal truth about what dedication and compassion can achieve." My grandfather's health began declining in early 1991. He knew his time was limited, and he wanted to share everything he'd learned about the vanishing shelter before it was too late. That's when he called me to his hospital bedside and gave me the folder containing 72 years of research. "I need you to understand why this matters," he said, his voice weaker but still clear.
This isn't just a ghost story or an unexplained phenomenon. It's proof that love and dedication can become permanent forces in the world. He'd spent his final months organizing his findings into a coherent narrative, not for publication or fame, but for understanding. He wanted future generations to know that Margaret Ashwood's story was real, and that it taught something important about human nature. "I've been thinking about what makes her different from other ghost stories," he told me. "Most hauntings are described as trapped souls, unable to move on, reliving trauma, or seeking resolution. But Margaret isn't trapped. She chose this. She's not reliving her death or her grief. She's continuing her life's work, helping people exactly as she wanted." This distinction was crucial to him. The vanishing shelter wasn't a tragedy or a curse. It was a gift that Margaret had somehow been allowed to give continuously across centuries. Her story wasn't about being unable to rest. It was about finding eternal purpose. He'd also been corresponding with a psychologist who specialized in studying altruism and selfless behavior. Dr. Helen Kwan had been fascinated by Margaret's transformation and proposed an interesting theory about consciousness and purpose. Dr. Kwan suggested that consciousness might not be confined to individual bodies the way we assume, my grandfather explained. She theorized that when someone dedicates themselves completely to a purpose beyond themselves, their consciousness might become identified with that purpose, rather than with their physical form. Margaret didn't just help travelers, she became helping itself. This philosophical perspective suggested that what we call Margaret Ashwood might actually be a manifestation of pure compassion, wearing the form and memories of the woman who originally embodied it. Not Margaret's ghost, but her love made tangible and permanent. "I find that beautiful," my grandfather said. "The idea that caring deeply enough about something can make it real in ways that transcend normal life and death." Margaret wanted to help people so intensely that she became an eternal helper. That's not supernatural. That's the natural result of absolute dedication. He showed me a letter he'd written but never sent, addressed to Margaret herself. In it, he thanked her for saving his life that night in 1919. He told her about the life he'd lived because of her intervention, the family he'd raised, the work he'd done, the people he'd helped in turn. He wanted her to know that her compassion had rippled outward, affecting not just him, but everyone he'd touched in 72 years. "I don't know if she can read this," he said. "I don't know if consciousness works that way. But I wanted to write it anyway. To acknowledge that her sacrifice, her choice to continue helping people, had meaning and impact far beyond those moments of immediate rescue." He'd also prepared advice for anyone who might encounter the vanishing shelter in the future. He wrote it as a set of simple guidelines, based on all his research and the experiences of others. "If you find the shelter, accept it gratefully, but don't try to take advantage. Use only what you need. Leave the place as you found it. Don't try to prove its existence to others or exploit it for attention." Margaret helps those in genuine need, not those seeking fame or curiosity. Treat the experience with respect and gratitude. And if you survive because of it, honor that gift by helping others in your own way. My grandfather believed that the shelter continued appearing because people respected it. Those who found it understood instinctively that it was sacred, not in a religious sense, but in the sense of being something precious that shouldn't be violated. No one had ever vandalized it, stolen from it, or tried to claim ownership. That collective respect might be part of what allowed it to persist. Maybe the shelter exists because humanity, collectively, wants it to exist, he mused. We need to believe that help can appear when we're truly desperate, that we're not completely alone in our worst moments. Margaret's compassion gave form to that need, and our collective faith in that compassion keeps it real. 3 days before he passed away, my grandfather told me something he'd never shared with anyone else. In his dreams over the years, he'd occasionally returned to that cabin. Not the way David had seen it, with Margaret visibly present, but as a peaceful place where he felt welcomed and safe. "I think she visits people in their dreams," he said, "people she's helped, just to let them know she's still there, still watching over travelers, still serving her purpose. I've dreamed of sitting by that fire dozens of times over the decades. Each time, I wake up feeling protected and grateful." He asked me to do something specific with his research. Don't publish it in scientific journals or sensationalist media. Just share the story in ways that honor Margaret. Let people know that extraordinary compassion existed, that it might still exist, and that it's worth believing in. The world needs that hope. His final words to me about the vanishing shelter were simple. "I've spent 72 years trying to understand a mystery, and I've learned that some mysteries are gifts. They're not meant to be solved, just appreciated. Margaret gave me life when I should have perished in that storm. Everything I've done since then has been borrowed time. A gift from a woman who died 2 centuries ago but never stopped caring. That's not a mystery to solve. That's grace." My grandfather passed away peacefully in May 1991. I kept my promise to him and preserved his research carefully, sharing Margaret's story only in ways that honored her gift. Over the years since then, I've received occasional letters from people claiming to have found the vanishing shelter. A hiker in 2003. A lost hunter in 2015. Each account follows the same pattern: desperate need, unexpected shelter, waking in an empty field, and a life forever changed by gratitude. I can't verify every story, but I believe them, because I understand now what my grandfather spent 72 years learning. Some mysteries exist not to be solved, but to remind us that compassion can transcend even death. Margaret Ashwood chose to become eternal help for those in need. Her cabin still appears somewhere in those mountains, waiting for the next desperate traveler. And when it does, someone will survive who otherwise wouldn't have. That's her legacy. That's her gift. If you ever find yourself lost in the wilderness, facing conditions you can't survive, and you see smoke rising through the trees from an impossible cabin, don't question it. Accept the shelter. Be grateful. Survive. Then live your life in a way that honors the extraordinary compassion that saved you. Because somewhere between past and present, between physical and spiritual, Margaret Ashwood is still tending her fire, still preparing her stew, still waiting to help the next person who truly needs her. The vanishing shelter is real, and that's the most beautiful mystery I know.